Okay, we'll give everyone a couple minutes to jump in. I see that we have the attendees list populating right now, but is gradually growing. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Tony Subketkau. I'm an associate here at Haynes and Boone in Washington, D.C., specializing in food and drug law. And I was previously an FDA employee at CFSAN and ORA. And I have the honor today of introducing Dr. Katz. But before I get into her bio, I'd like to take a brief moment to acknowledge Stan Milstein. So Stan previously served as acting deputy director for FDA's Office of Cosmetics and Colors at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. But he retired in 2017 after 26 years of service to the agency. However, Stan, being who he is, later came out of retirement to serve as a special advisor in the same office. So I just want to take this moment to acknowledge Stan because he's been instrumental in really helping us organize this event and connecting me with Dr. Katz. And so just want to take that brief moment to thank him. And so I have the honor today of introducing Dr. Linda Katz. So Dr. Linda Katz, MD and MPH, is the director of the Office of Cosmetics and Colors at CFSAN, and she assumed that position on September 3rd, 2002. Prior to her current role, Dr. Katz served as the supervisory medical officer at FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And in that role, she served as the deputy director for the division of over-the-counter drug products and also associate director of cosmetic drug products. In these capacities, she was actively involved in the review and approval of OTC drugs and served as the liaison to CFSAN on cosmetic products having drug claims. Dr. Katz was also the deputy director of the division of dermatologic and dental drug products and has a proven record in program management, regulatory policymaking, and supervision. So Dr. Katz brings to CFSAN a strong background in science. So she received her Bachelor of Arts degree, magna cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania in biology, her Master of Public Health degree from the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and her MD degree from the University of Connecticut. She served her internship and residency at the George Washington Medical Center here in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Katz began her career at FDA in 1989, working in CDER as a primary medical reviewer for the investigational new drugs and new drug applications before assuming her supervisory management responsibilities. So she's an accomplished public speaker and the author of numerous scientific publications. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Katz.
Thank you very much, Tony. And thank you very much for inviting me today to give this talk. So basically today I'll talk about tattoos, the renewal of an ancient art. I have our disclaimer, which I'm not going to go into, but over the next 40 to 45 minutes, what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about the history of tattooing, how cosmetic products are regulated at the FDA, a little bit about permanent tattoo inks, tattoo inks themselves, the potential of health effects, adverse event reporting, and some of our activities in tattoos, including research, and hopefully there'll be time so I can do temporary tattoos as well. So let me begin with the history of tattooing. And anyone who is familiar with tattoos probably has heard about Otzi, the Iceman. And when he was found, it was noted that he had 61 tattoos that were made of soot rubbed into different incisions. And if you look at the picture that I have here, you can see a variety of horizontal lines, which were his tattoos. Since that time, their tattoos have gained in popularity and differences with the techniques being done. Many ancient peoples would do tattoos with taking soot and charcoal and other color pigments that were available and take a branch and a hammer-like object to go ahead and ingrain that under the skin to make decorative art. The actual origin of the word tattoo comes from the Polynesian word tatau, meaning correct or workmanlike. And in fact, because of the amount of activity it took to get a tattoo, it was workmanlike. The term tattoo was brought to Europe by the explorer James Cook in 1769 after his first voyage to Tahiti and New Zealand. And in fact, it had gained some popularity in the Western world in the early 1800s. It sort of fell off from popularity until probably about World War I and World War II, and more popular in World War II, when soldiers and sailors who were served in the Far East would come back with tattoos from different places where they had been. But actually, it was in the late 1990s and early 2000s that it began to resurge again in popularity. Today, tattoos are used primarily for cosmetic purposes, excuse me, or decorative purposes, but they may also be used for certain medical uses, such as to cover the different pigmentation issues in vitiligo, reconstruction, and for tumor markings. So when we think about tattooing in the United States, it's a fairly large industry. In fact, Americans spend approximately $1.65 billion annually on tattoos. In addition to that, there are about 20 to 30% of the US population has been estimated to have at least one tattoo. And if you look over on the chart that I have over on the right, you'll see that between 2012 and 2021, that the percentage of tattoos have increased both for one tattoo and multiple tattoos. And currently it's estimated that about 26% of US population will have at least more than one tattoo. Tattooing itself is a fairly global market, and the US inks are available for sale online to consumers worldwide. In addition, we have certain inks that come to our country from other places in the world. With all that being said, however, there's very few data on the industry, the volume, and place of manufacture, packaging, and distribution information. So as I go through today, I will talk a little bit about some of those problems, but in addition, I'd like to sort of identify some of the regulatory status of tattooing in the United States and divided it into three buckets. The tattoo inks, which meet the definition of a cosmetic that I'll define on the next slide. Tattoo pigments, which meet the definition of a color additive that I will also define and describe later. And tattooing itself, which is the practice of tattooing, that is actually regulated by state and local jurisdictions. And they're the ones who would be responsible for licensing the tattoo parlor, making sure that hygiene set conditions are met, and that the tattoo artists have also the appropriate training to make sure that the artwork and the practice itself is safe. So what is a tattoo? And basically tattoos, cosmetics rather, are defined in the Federal Food and Drug Act on Section 201I as articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. The definition does not cover for cosmetics the treatment, diagnosis, mitigation, or prevention of a disease, which is a drug, nor does it cover the effect of a structure or function of the body. And in fact, if a product affects the structure or function of the body, it meets the definition of a drug, not a cosmetic. In the last bullet, I've highlighted some terms that have become commonplace, but again, are not defined in the Act. Personal care products have been touted as being cosmetics, but in fact, if you look at the rubric of what falls under personal care products, many of those are not cosmetics, but would also include over-the-counter products, may also include devices and certain products that are regulated by CFSAN. Cosmeceuticals was a term that was coined in the 1990s by industry and dermatologists as a term to define a cosmetic that was something more than a cosmetic because it would affect the structure or function. And as I just mentioned, if it affects the structure or function of the body, the product is a drug, not a cosmetic, or it could be both depending upon the intended use. In addition, natural and organic are also not defined in the Act. So what is a color additive? A color additive is a substance that imparts color to a food, drug, cosmetic, medical device, or human body. And over on the right, I have some pictures of some pigments that would be considered color additives. Color additives must be safe and pre-approved, that is listed in the regulations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Individual color additives may only be used as allowed by regulations. and that certain color additives require FDA laboratory batch certification to ensure that the specifications are met. Our authority for the regulation of cosmetics and color additives comes from the following: the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the 1960 Color Additive Amendment to the Act, and the 1966 Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. In addition, other applicable regulations include the tamper-resistant packaging and the child-resistant packaging. Our cosmetic authority is basically that cosmetics must not be adulterated or misbranded. Both of those are prohibited acts. The FDA does not have the authority to pre-approve cosmetic products or their ingredients, with the exception of color additives. That is, FDA's authority for cosmetics is post-market. However, as I just mentioned, color additives are the only ingredient in cosmetics that are subject to FDA pre-market approval. In addition, manufacturers are responsible for making sure that the cosmetics that they market in retail are safe and are under the intended conditions of use. Cosmetics should be properly labeled, and adverse event reporting and registration are voluntary. And both of this is important, and I'll come back to it because it limits the amount of information we know, both on the safety of tattoos and where to find manufacturers, because they do not have to register. So as I mentioned previously, the two prohibited acts for cosmetics are that cosmetics must not be adulterated nor misbranded. And basically, adulterated cosmetics are cosmetics that would contain poisonous or deleterious substance that would render them injurious under labeled or customary conditions of use. They consist of a filthy substance. They may be prepared, packed, or held under insanitary conditions. Again, that may have contaminated or rendered injurious. The container may be composed of any poisonous substance rendering the product injurious, or that it contains a color additive other than a coal tar hair dye that doesn't conform to the applicable regulations under Section 721 of the Act. Misbranded cosmetics, on the other hand, are cosmetics that have false or misleading information or don't contain all of the required information. The labeling may be improperly placed or inconspicuous, that they may be in a misleading container, that there's non-compliant packaging, that is, that it doesn't comply with Section 3 or 4 of the Poison Prevention Packaging Act of 1970, and that under the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, it doesn't contain ingredient declarations so that consumers can make informed purchase decisions. With regard to our regulatory authority over color additives, as I mentioned, must be pre-approved by the FDA for their use in foods, drugs, cosmetics, and medical devices, and must be safe for their intended use. Safe means that there is convincing evidence that establishes with reasonable certainty that no harm will result from the intended use of the color additive. Approved color additives are listed in the Code of Federal Regulations in 21 parts 73, 74, and 82. So how does a color additive get FDA approval? And it's important to note that, and I'm not going to go through the whole approval process, but a firm would submit a color additive petition to the FDA. The firm also must provide information on the chemical description and uses, exposure estimates, toxicology studies, environmental assessments, and the FDA will review the data to make the determination if safety is shown. If it is found to be safe, it will be listed, as I mentioned, in the CFR, with its specifications, uses, and restrictions. So that when we think about color additives, again, we also think about the issue of that their color additives may be exempt from certification as well as subject to certification. And so that color additives that are synthetic dyes and pigments are batch certified in order to limit potential carcinogenic contaminants. Those that are exempt from certification have plant, animal, or mineral sources and are not required to be batch certified. So let me go through this a little bit in more detail. So those exempt from certification are those that that sources are natural sources from animal, botanical, or mineral sources. Manufacturers are responsible for compliance with the CFR requirements, including purity specifications, and those are outlined in 21 Part 73. For color additives subject to certification, these are the synthetic organic colors again, and that here the manufacturers must submit a sample to the FDA from each new batch. And the FDA's color certification program will analyze the sample. If the requirements are met, FDA will issue a certificate and an FDA lot number, and then it will attach the FD&C, DNC, and external DNC nomenclature for the certified batches. The requirements are found in 21 CFR, parts 74 and 82. So in addition, the status of color additives for use in injections is also stipulated in the CFR. And these are found in 21 CFR 70.5B. And basically what this provision states is that no listing or certification of a color additive shall be considered to authorize the use of any such color additive and any article intended for use in injections unless such listing or certification of such color additive specifically provides for such use. That being said, currently there are no color additives that have been approved by FDA for injection into the skin for cosmetic purposes, and no tattoo pigments have been approved by FDA for use in tattoo inks. So that brings us up to what is a tattoo? And let me start with the definition of a permanent tattoo. Basically, as the name implies, a permanent tattoo is something that is intended to be permanent, even though the color may slightly fade over time. Its purpose is decorative body art. It can also be used as part of a permanent makeup. And in many cases, people will do this so that way they don't have to put on makeup in the morning, or if they're working at night, again, the makeup won't get smudged and people can look as pristine any time of the day as when they first put the makeup on. Permanent tattoos may also be used for medical camouflage, as I mentioned earlier, as well as for concealment of imperfections, eschars, wounds, or other disfigurements. Needles are used to pierce the skin to deposit pigment into the intradermal space. And the piercing goes about 2 to 4 millimeters below the surface of the epidermis or the skin. Pigments reside primarily in the cytosol of the cells, in intracellular spaces or both. But it's also important to note, and I'll come back to this a little bit later when I talk about some adverse events and some concerns about tattoos, is that some of the pigments may be picked up by the lymphatic system and get deposited in lymph nodes as well as other organs within the lymphatic system. So what are found in tattoo inks? And actually, as I mentioned, tattoo inks are mixtures that are intended to be injected into the skin. They consist of 4 different components, and they're suspensions of non-soluble pigments in liquids that contain binders, solvents, additives, and pigments. In this diagram that I have, you can see that some of the binders include polyethers, polyvinyl prolidine. Solvents may include water, ethanol, isopropyl alcohol, and glycerin. Additives may contain surfactants and preservatives. And pigments are divided up into inorganic, organic, and carbon black. And I have some examples of metal salts that would be consistent with inorganic pigments, as well as azo pigments are listed as well. But there's one additional feature is that of concern, and those are the impurities. And these may be heavy metals, aromatic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and unknown chemical contaminants that are sometimes not classified at the time that the pigments that we look at the inks themselves. And this is one area where we're doing some research to try to figure out what kind of chemical contaminants may occur. I show this slide because this is also particularly relevant and gets a point home. That, as I mentioned before, the pigments are insoluble and they may come from a variety of different sources. Most of them are the sources that they may come from come from other industrial uses, and they would include automotive paint, residential or artist paint, printer toners, textile dyes, and other sources. The concerns are as well that aside from the coming from a commercial source, which was not really intended for human use, they may also include some ingredients to enhance industrial product performance, which are not known to the tattoo ink manufacturers, that may also be harmful for human use. In addition, some additional things are added to make the paint colors that are used in tattoo pigments more vibrant, because some of the more traditional pigments may not be quite as vibrant or fluorescent. So that the processing methods also may impact the pigment safety and are not well known. In sort of shifting gears slightly, I'm going to talk a little bit about adverse event investigation because it leads into some of the activity and the research that we've been doing. And it's important to note, as I mentioned before, that the adverse event reporting for cosmetics is sporadic, and we don't get a lot of it because it is voluntary. Over the past several years, probably 10 or 15, we've started to get a bit more because we've been going out to make sure that consumers, healthcare providers, and artists are aware of our concerns and our need to know this information. We've gone out to a variety of different conferences to talk about our need for this information. And we also on our website have gone out with consumer updates and constituent updates to get this information about safety and our concerns across. The attribution of the source of contamination also may be difficult to establish. That is, it's unclear whether or not it's where the source comes from. It could be from the parlor practice, the equipment in the parlor, manufacturing, or the container itself. And so basically, the more information that we could get, helps us to educate industry and consumers about the safety issues and ways, the most effective solutions to the problems. So some of the problems that we see with tattoos, I've divided up just a little bit here, but this is not the totality of them. We sometimes hear from consumers about complaints, and that complaints may be mild abnormal experiences such as itching and swelling that may not result in them needing to seek any medical advice or treatment. Other problems that we know about are difficulties with removal of the tattoos and some complications that may occur from laser removal. There's also been some issues with magnetic resonance imaging or MRIs due to the fact that heavy metals may be found in some of the tattoos, which have adverse effects on the MRI and may cause some burning. In addition, some people have regrets and that for the tattoo that they had, and it's often difficult to get rid of those regretful tattoos. But leaving that aside, there are true complications that may be serious adverse event reactions or events that need professional medical advice and treatment. So on this slide, what I've done is divided up break out some of the complications according to the kind of the hazards that might be associated with them. We may see chemical hazards due to the ink ingredients that may be immunotoxic, carcinogenic, mutagenic, may have some reprotoxic problems, some acute toxicities, sensitizing or corrosive. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with some of the research that we're doing in the next several slides. In addition, that there may be microbial infections, and these may occur immediately after the tattooing, or they may occur months or years down the line. And some of the microbial infections may be due to bacteria, virus, or fungal, or combinations thereof. There may also be allergic reactions, either type 1 or type 4 reactions. And I've listed some of the clinical manifestations that we've seen, which include urticaria, plaques, papulonodules, granulomas, etc. Further, as I've mentioned, that there may be foreign body reactions, and these are often restricted to parts of the tattoo, most common in Black tattoos. And these may manifest with granulomas or systemic sarcoidosis. But probably the other hazards that are associated with it are with sun-induced irritation, such as swelling, burning sensation, and even pulling of parts of the skin, pain, stinging sensation, itching, heat and cold reactions, and those occur in the vast majority. And I'll digress for a moment just to kind of get the point across. When I remember years ago, and probably this is probably close to now, maybe 20 or 25 years ago, when I was in a rest stop in New Jersey with my family on a really hot, humid day. The person in front of us had a fairly large tattoo on his bicep, and the tattoo was of a heart with a dagger going through it. While we were waiting online and it was pretty hot, you could start to see the skin expand. And at one point, you could actually see the drops of blood coming from where the dagger pierced the heart. When my daughter noticed it, she said, "Oh, Mom, look how realistic this is." Well, in fact, it was realistic because it was real blood that was dripping. So these are some complications that may occur. Over here, I'd like to just show you a few slides of pictures of adverse events. And the first one that's listed A, you can actually see that there's some swelling and erythema in the red area of the tattoo itself. Red pigments are those that are most notoriously responsible for allergic reactions. And so that commonly this kind of a reaction would be seen. And if biopsied, it would be consistent with an allergic response. On the second one, which are the lips, these came from a picture of a person who had a significant allergic reaction to a permanent makeup, which resulted in her having permanent disfigurement and scarring. So when did we start to become more focused with tattoos? And basically, probably I'd say that we began to become more aware of problems with tattoos starting in about 2003. Prior to that time, we really didn't have any adverse event reports associated with tattooing. But beginning in about 2003 to 2004, we ended up with a significant amount of adverse event reports related to Premier Pigment's second batch, and this was of a permanent makeup. And you could see that, in fact, we ended up with close to 200 adverse event reports coming in. What this graph shows is that the peaks and valleys that we have with the reports, where you see the spikes, those were other adverse events that we received or outbreaks that occurred, and mostly those were related to microbial contamination rather than allergic manifestations, as with the Premier pigment. So for microbial infections from tattoos, as I mentioned before, they can come from 3 different sources, usually bacterial infections, viral infections, or fungal infections. They may come from contaminated inks that may have been contaminated at the manufacturing site, or that they may get contaminated because of insufficient hygiene practices in the tattoo parlor itself, as a result of the use of non-sterile diluents, including the the use of tap water. And in fact, several of the outbreaks we had, which resulted with infections from non-tuberculous mycobacterium, were because of the use of tap water. Other problems can arise because of non-sterile tattooing instruments and the sharing of contaminated needles. Finally, also infections can result because of inadequate healing process and incorrect and inappropriate care for the tattoo after it was placed. So as I mentioned, between 2003 and 2015, we started seeing more adverse event reports associated with tattooing itself. Between 2003 and 2015, where you see those arrows, that's where we had 7 voluntary recalls because of outbreaks and adverse events that were reported to the FDA. In response to these microbiological problems and these outbreaks, we initiated a microbiological survey and inspection with sampling goal to examine the prevalence of microbial contamination in both the tattoo ink and permanent makeup products sold in the United States, as well as to examine manufacturing distribution conditions of these products. Beginning in 2016, we undertook 3 surveys in conjunction with NCTR. And rather than talk about each survey individually, I've combined all 3 surveys so that we can look at it in total of what happens because it is relevant. And again, I want to thank NCTR for their help in this activity. As you can see, we examined a total of 197 tattoo samples. Of these, 107 were tattoo inks, 84 were permanent makeup inks, and 6 were diluents. That these came from 26 different manufacturers, 22 of whom were domestic and 4 were foreign. So let me go on to show you what the results indicated. That clearly we saw from the 197 samples that 68 or 35% were contaminated with some kind of microbial contamination. When you break them down by products, there are 42 or 39% of the tattoo inks were contaminated, 26 or 31% of the permanent makeup inks were contaminated, and none of the diluents were. When we broke them further by based on microbial type and colony forming units, it's important to note that about 35% or 68 of those that were contaminated, about 59 or 86% were bacterial contaminations only. About 7 were bacterial and fungal, and 2 were fungal only. If you look at the colony forming units and that we break down here, and what's important about this is that in our bacteriological analytical manual, chapter 23, we describe how many colony forming units are allowed to be to occur or to be reported within cosmetic products. So that when above 1,000, that's considered to be objectionable. Less than 1,000 colony forming units may not be objectionable depending upon the cosmetic and where it's being used. For eye area and mucosal products, that limit goes down lower to about less than 500. But as you look at the breakdown by colony forming units, you can see that about a third were contaminated, even though less than 100 colony forming units. About a third made up between 100 to 1,000, and greater than 1,000 colony forming units were found also in a third. As a result of these findings, we've gone back to look at our what we've concluded in the BAM chapter 23, and we've made some modifications in terms of interpretations and how to interpret these findings, findings in general for cosmetic products. When we go back further to look at microbial contamination based on sterilization, and I stop here to say that some products actually are listed as being sterilized or having gone through some sterilization procedure, that 34% of those that we sampled were found to still have contamination. And in 107 that were the tattoo inks where sterility was claimed, again, about a third were not sterile. And for those where sterility was unknown, about a third also were found to be not sterile. The bacteria identified in the tattoo inks were totaled about 148 different bacterial isolates from 26 different genuses and 74 different species. And Bacillus species made up the largest at 51%. With regard to bacterial identification in tattoo inks, I've listed some that we've found, but that basically there are 70 potentially clinically relevant species that were found in the products that we looked at. So the bottom line is that as a result of all of the surveys and working with NCTR further, we've gone back to work with our with industry and have discussed with industry what needs to be done in terms of both the sterilization process and making sure that the products they're selling are safe and are devoid of bacteria before they sell it and send it on distributions. So let me go on then a little bit to talk about some of our research relevant to tattoos from the other perspective of looking at the chemistry and heavy metals and getting a better understanding of what's actually in the color additives themselves. So that we've been trying to work on regulatory method development. And with that, we've been doing to look at, to identify and quantitate color additives and contaminants of concern. We're looking at the stability of the injected pigments and the impact on light, because as I mentioned before, light will affect the pigments and the tattoo itself. We looked at color additive extraction and quantification from the skin. So we're assessing toxicology and variability by color additive or in composition. We've also been looking at mouse models as a surrogate for toxicologic studies and some physiologic responses of the body to pigments. So I'll go through in a little bit of detail, but not a lot, basically, so that I can leave enough time for questions themselves. But with regard to our regulatory methods development, it's important to note that, as I mentioned earlier, that the analysis of pigments is difficult in tattoo inks because of its low solubility and interference from other tattoo ink components. We've started to develop qualitative methods to identify pigments in the tattoo inks and to try to set up libraries of pigment standards for rapid screening in these inks. We're also trying to develop quantitative methods to detect potentially harmful constituents, such as the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the primary aromatic amines, and heavy metals, as well as others, and doing surveys in of tattoo inks in the marketplace. What this slide shows is basically some of the pigments that we've been looking at and the qualitative methodology to identify them. So that as we basically try to identify the pigments, we need to consider the chemistry of the individual pigments themselves, whether they're organic, inorganic, or organometallic. That we use a combination of different chromatographic and spectroscopy techniques to be able to do these assessments. And it's important to note that one method may be confirmatory for another due to the complexity of the mixtures themselves. In this slide, I've also identified some of the pigments that we have been able to identify, and you can see them as well on the slide over to the right. We've also been looking at photo decomposition. And the photo decomposition itself is important, as I've mentioned, and we've been doing studies on absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination of the tattoo inks. The inks that we've been studying have been pigment yellow 74 and pigment orange 13, and also looking to see what their decomposition products might be. We've been looking at pigment extraction and quantification. And again, extraction methods are developed to quantitatively measure the concentration of tattoo pigments and their laser decomposition products from aqueous suspension or lysed human skin. And again, it's important to note what the byproducts will come out to be. And we were looking at stability. And the stability itself of pigments is important because, as I mentioned before, light may interfere or may damage the pigments themselves and may make their byproducts more harmful than what they were initially. So we've done some research with NCTR on mouse tattoo with red pigments at 22 to study the loss of pigment and its decomposition as a result of exposure to ambient light, simulated solar light, and laser radiation. We've also been following where the pigments migrate in the body after tattooing. And this again, this was how we were able to determine that many of the pigments go into the lymph nodes and other lymphatic organs. There's certain pigments may decompose in the skin itself, and the rate of pigment decline may be based on the pigment's stability when exposed to a variety of different sources. There are a variety of different decomposition products, and the safety assessments are necessary to establish the safety of the pigments that are being used for injection. In addition to that, we're also looking at the toxicology and doing assessments with human dermal fibroblasts exposed to UV radiation in the presence of inks containing titanium dioxide, and their ability to generate hydroxyl radicals, indicating potential phototoxicity as well. We've also been looking at the medical toxicological overviews and issues of concern, and have been working with others, not only in the US, but elsewhere, to get a better idea and understanding of what happens to these pigments. particularly at injection site during the lifetime of the tattoo and laser removal, as well as what happens from substance migration from the site, phototoxicity, and metabolic and immunoreactions of ingredients and toxicity in vivo. So as you've gathered from what I've said, there is a large gap in our research and a large gap in our knowledge. And we still need to do more work on the composition of tattoo inks. We still need to do more work on the safety of the inks and ingredients, including pigments and diluents. And we still need to look at the effects of manufacturing, particularly for sterility and what happens if gamma radiation is used for sterility. What will that result in the future? And the long-term health effects from exposure to tattoo inks are unknown and need to be further evaluated. So let me, for the remaining moments that I have, switch a little bit to talk about temporary tattoos. And as the name implies, temporary tattoos are temporary. They're not permanent decorations of the skin. Most are plant-based dyes and other stains that bind to keratin in the skin that can last days to weeks. They may be drawn, painted, or airbrushed, or applied directly on the skin through decals. If they're applied using decals or transfers, some may have backings, some may not. The bottom line is that they don't have needles. They may be regulated as, they're actually regulated as cosmetics, and there's a direct application to the skin, as I mentioned before. With regard to its uses, these are a form of self-expression and body decoration, somewhat similar to that of the permanent tattoos, but again, they are not permanent. They may also be part of cultural and ceremonial uses. And the advantages over permanent is that if a consumer decides that they don't want a tattoo any longer, they will fade away or easier to wash off, or they can be removed without using any things such as laser to get rid of them, so that they may be a safer alternative. They do not involve needles, that some decals or transfers may contain color additives that are approved for applications to the skin, and that the design fades over time so that it can be changed, reapplied, or something else can be used. This slide shows basically the different types of temporary tattoos and how they are actually classified. So that we have transfers and decals that I talked a little bit about, henna, black henna, and then some of the others, other types, which include ballpoint pens for decorations and jagua. But let me spend a little bit more time on the transfers and decals. As I mentioned before, that some images are applied directly to the skin, and that they may contain an approved, that if they're applied directly to the skin, they must contain an approved color additive. If they're not directly applied to the skin because there's a backing or a barrier, then they don't need necessarily a color additive unless there will be migration from the backing onto the skin. These transfers and decals last for days up to a week. And again, they're gone shortly after that. With regard to henna, henna comes from plant dyes that are used to stain the hair or skin. It's important to note that henna is approved as a color additive for use in hair dyes, but not for the skin. It produces a brown, orange, brown, or reddish brown kind of a tint color. And they will last anywhere from 3 days up to a few weeks. Black henna is not approved, and that it basically may contain a hair dye component such as phenylendiamine to make it black. What's important to note is that PPD is a very potent skin sensitizer or allergen, and so that once someone is exposed to PPD from a black henna, that anytime that the individual is exposed to PPD in other commercial sources, including hair dyes, a reaction may occur. Some of the reactions that have occurred have resulted in scarring and changes in skin pigmentation, that some of the reactions may be increased as a result of UV sensitivity. And again, black henna is not approved or permitted for use on the skin. It may last from 2 to 6 weeks, depending upon the exposure to sun, water, and scrubbing. And as I mentioned before, I'm not going to go any further into the ballpoint pen decorations or jagua, other than to say jagua gives a deep blue-black color, and it comes from unripened fruit of the Genepana americana tree. The bottom line is that the safety has not been established for any of these color additives unless they are approved for use in cosmetics for application on the skin. This picture shows a black henna on the left, and on the right, you'll see a reaction that occurred to the black henna from the PPD. So in summary, tattoos are considered cosmetics and tattoo pigments are considered color additives. Companies are responsible for making sure cosmetics are safe under intended conditions of use. The FDA does not have the authority to conduct pre-market safety reviews of cosmetic products. In fact, all of cosmetics are reviewed post-market only, and the only portion of a cosmetic or ingredient of a cosmetic that undergoes pre-market approval are color additives. The composition of tattoo inks is largely unknown. That no color additives have been approved by FDA for injection into the skin for cosmetic purposes. We monitor the adverse events that come in to the FDA via MedWatch or CARES to be able to make assessments as to what kind of work we need to do further from a regulatory perspective and what kind of action might need to be taken. As I mentioned before, adverse event reporting is voluntary, and practitioners in industry are encouraged to report adverse events, but again, our reporting is scarce. The full range of potential adverse health effects from tattoo inks are unknown. That FDA's ongoing research has led us to have some voluntary recalls of contaminated inks to protect consumers. Temporary tattoos, as the name implies, are not permanent, but can have a wide variety of adverse effects associated with them as well. And that the FDA can take enforcement actions for products that are found to be adulterated or misbranded. Some of our future goals, as I've mentioned during this talk, are to get a better understanding of the composition, method of preservation, and safe use of injectable tattoos. It's for us to also get better tools to assess human health risks from tattoo inks and pigments, to have a better understanding of the tattoo industry. We will continue to outreach with all of our stakeholders and make them aware of problems as we find them. And again, regulatory and policy changes are under consideration. With that, I'd like to acknowledge people from my own staff, as well as from NCTR and other places within CFSAN for their help in putting this slide together. And with that, I guess I'm ready to take some questions.
Hi, everyone. You can submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom. And Dr. Katz, I'll let you take the lead on the questions you want to take from the Q&A, and I can also ask some and throw some in there too as well.
Okay, so a question came in. Did one of the earlier slides state that to date, FDA has not approved any color pigments or inks? Please clarify. FDA has not approved any color additives for use in tattoo inks. So that there are no approved color additives that are currently used in tattoo inks. The second question that came in is henna and black henna are used only for hair dye, but are not to be used on the skin. Isn't it difficult to dye hair without skin contact on the scalp? And yes, that is difficult to do, but if you actually dye hair, the intended purpose of that is not to dye, to put the actual pigment onto the scalp. And so that when people do dye their hair, again, it's not intended to go onto the scalp itself. So what regulatory changes is the FDA currently considering? And that I mentioned that we've gone back to look at our chapter 23 of the BAM to make to look at what modifications might be necessary to be able to make tattoo inks, to be able to accommodate tattoo inks within the way we look at the cosmetic products. One additional question was, so it sounds like essentially all these inks being used in products not approved for these uses, but FDA doesn't regulate the actual tattoo parlor. but does not take action against the firm selling to the tattoo parlors. So FDA traditionally has not exercised its regulatory authority over tattoo inks or color additives used in tattoos. However, if there is a problem and we're made aware that there is a problem, we will take action. As you can tell from one of the slides that I mentioned before, that we worked with industry when we found contamination in the microbial contamination in tattoo inks. We worked with them to go ahead and to remove or to voluntarily recall the contaminated pigments and tattoo inks so that they would not be available for consumer use. Okay. Okay. Why are dyes that are placed on the skin regulated and injected skin are not? And that's actually a good question. It's not that they're not regulated. It's that they are, that basically they both are regulated. What we've chosen to do in the past is that we've taken enforcement discretion basically because until recently, most of the issues related to the dyes were that related to the microbial contamination. And there we've actually taken enforcement action when we found that we do have contaminated dyes to remove them from the marketplace. Okay, so let me then, there, it looks like there was something in the chat. And I guess that was sort of it. So I don't know if there were any other questions that you have, Tony.
Yeah, I have one question, Dr. Katz. What specific feature about the red pigments makes them more likely to cause allergic reactions?
And this, I think I may actually have to punt a little bit, but there's something about the feature itself that what's in the pigments that actually just causes more sensitization than some of the others. And so that I'd have to get back with you to go back to look to see specifically why, but they seem to be the color that causes the most problems for allergic reactions. And again, there must be something in them that is basically picked up by the immune system as recognized as being foreign that sets a reaction going.
It's just some practical questions I have for you as well. So if you had to pick just one or two issues, what are some of the issues or concerns that about tattoos that you wish the general public that were getting these tattoos were more aware of?
That basically before someone gets a tattoo, a person should really be aware that the knowledge about tattoos and the practice itself are somewhat limited. That if anyone has any significant underlying medical issues, medical problems, if they're immunocompromised, they might want to think twice, but definitely before getting a tattoo, they should talk to their practitioner to make sure that it would be something that they could do safely if they wanted to do it. And in those circumstances, a temporary tattoo might be safer than a permanent one.
Same question, but with industry stakeholders.
With regard to industry itself, that we would also want industry to be aware of the fact that there are different ways that the inks may become contaminated and that more work needs to be done to look at sterility and to see what happens both from the standpoint of getting rid of the microbes, if microbes are occurring within the manufacturing process, but also what happens to the actual pigments themselves in terms of whether or not they will then become, give off more harmful contaminants than they would have had they not been sterilized by a certain procedure. And those are things that the industry needs to think about as well.
So since you've been working in this space for a long time, what are some observations you have as in terms of how the regulatory space has changed over the years and like how FDA is reacting to the regulations a little bit differently?
Well, when I first started in this space, as I mentioned, there were very few reports that we got of any problems with tattoo inks because we didn't get generally a lot of reports. But since about 2003, we've basically started seeing more problems, more outbreaks. And what it has helped to do is it has helped us to focus on where we need to do extra work. And that by that, I mean in terms of microbial assessments, as well as looking at for heavy metals, how to identify pigments, so that we can figure out better what is actually in them so that safer products could be marketed.
So we have a follow-up question about that specifically. What type of safety testing would you like to see on industry's behalf?
Um, Industry really needs to make sure that they're doing the appropriate microbial safety testing, that is to make sure that their products are not contaminated with bacteria, viruses, or fungi. But in addition to that, they need to go back to look to see what kinds of other substances might be in their inks, such as heavy metals, any other constituents that could be harmful, and what the long-term effects might be from the inks themselves or the pigments that are being used within the inks.
And just from your perspective, personally, what do you find most interesting about working in this area?
It's a fascinating area with a lot of questions, and an area in which we still need to come up with a lot of answers to make sure that we can have a safer product out there.
And last question, just for people considering getting tattoos, what's a good resource? Is it just like to go do your diligence and understand what kind of risks are out there? Would it just be the OCAC website?
You can look at our website, you can look at CDC's website. And in fact, there are a variety of different websites on the web, just even Googling, that would be very helpful. But I also encourage people to make sure that before you get a tattoo, to go and make sure that you know a little bit more about the safety of the polymer itself and a bit about the tattoo artist, because that also impacts long-term safety.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, Dr. Katz. We really appreciate it. And I know I've learned a lot within the presentation. Well, we look forward to working with you again, and also the future event and speaker series we have within the FDA Alumni Association. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. And please tune in for our next feature here. And Dr. Katz, thank you once again. And Stan Bilstein, also thank you once again. Have a great day, everyone.
And thanks. Bye.
Bye.